Hello, welcome to The Moment. This time I have 3 topics. I'll be talking about a new fund to deal with right-wing extremism in Newcastle. I'll be looking at the recent reductions in police station opening times across the region and how this relates to Northumbria Police's budget. And finally, I'll be talking about a report from Action on Smoking and Health that talks about how people's attitude to smoking has changed since the smoking ban. But for right now, let's turn to the first story. £500,000 has been set aside to tackle right-wing extremism in Newcastle. According to the Chronicle, the money will be pledged by the Home Office as, quote, politicians say the city is seen as a target for the far right. Councillor Nick Kemp, the cabinet member responsible for the Safer Newcastle partnership, revealed details of the project at a meeting. The Chronicle then go on to quote the councillor as saying, "The extremists we are seeing in the north are of far right tendencies. The issues are around the far right as a whole, not just Islamophobia. We are taking care not to separate the two problems." The kinds of groups that the councillor is talking about tackling are the English Defence League and Pegida UK. The latter, of course, held their first rally in Newcastle in 2015. The website Powerbase has a brief description of Pegida UK, saying, quote, Pegida UK was set up in January 2015 in an attempt to replicate the anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant Pegida protests seen in Germany. The founder, Tommy Robinson, said he hoped Pegida UK would be different from the English Defence League, that it would attract a more middle-class demographic and would discourage the loutish behaviour and alcohol-fuelled violence of the EDL. So that's a very brief description of Pegida UK, and I would have read what they stand for from their own website, only it's blocked by internet security. But essentially, the £500,000 is going towards fighting groups like and including Pegida UK. However, Newcastle has also played host to activists on the other side of the spectrum. On the 24th of April, the Chronicle had an article about a march on International Workers' Day. This event had people from various different groups, many benign, like the National Union of Teachers and Unite. But there were also others there. According to the story, quote, as Chion Wara, Labour's MP for Newcastle, arrived, members of the Communist Party started shouting, the Labour Party is not and never has been a socialist party, through a megaphone. The point here is that Councillor Nick Kemp has shown a desire to tackle right-wing groups, but says nothing of the left. Now, of course, there is a difference between a few communist hecklers at a diverse rally and a Pegida rally. However, in 2014, Newcastle's Palestine Solidarity campaign held a rally at Gray's Monument, and to many this would be considered controversial and extreme. Again, to say that Newcastle has to tackle right-wing groups up to and including Pegida, but doesn't need to do the same with left-wing groups, is rather disingenuous. It's rather disconcerting that this is something that the Home Office has pledged money towards. Once there's an incentive like that to limit what groups are allowed to speak, you enter very dodgy territory insofar as who has freedom of speech. My view is that everyone should get the chance to speak, even those with whom you strongly disagree. Letting bad ideas be voiced is the only way to test them against good ideas, and it's the only way we grow as a society. If you crack down on certain groups but not others, all you're doing is pushing them underground where they can become more desperate and more violent, and their ideas can become more attractive even to people who want to subvert the status quo. So now let's move on to the second story. Over the last month, Northumbria Police have been reducing opening hours of 27 police stations across the region. According to Northumbria Police's website, quote, these changes are being made in response to a significant decline in the use of front offices. This is due to people using other means of communication to report incidents, including the use of online and phone services. Despite these changes, Northumbria Police will maintain 24 front offices operating across the force area. They then say, quote, "The savings that are generated will be used to support operational policing and invest in greater accessibility to the service we provide. There are no plans to close any operational stations." So further down they quote Northumbria Police's Chief Constable Steve Ashman as saying, "We are still wrestling with the impact of austerity, and the cuts that we have faced in Northumbria are the largest of any force in the country." At the bottom of the page, they provide a table of all 27 stations affected and what the new operating times will be. I'll leave the link to this page in the description so you can see the full list, since it's quite extensive. But some of the stations are Gateshead, which will be operating from 8 AM to 8 PM 7 days a week. Ettal Lane, which goes from being open 24/7 to 9 to 5 5 days a week. Byker, which used to be open 8 till midnight and will now be operating from 9 to 5 as well. Stations in Bedlington, Ashington, Cramlington, Blythe and Morpeth are all affected as well. So it's a pretty extensive reduction, and while it's not the be-all and end-all, as the statement says, most people are going online or do call up to report incidents, it does demonstrate the budgetary constraints on Northumbria Police. So let's take a look at Northumbria Police's budget report for 2017 to 18. It says, quote, "The last 6 years have seen unprecedented cuts to the funding provided by the government to police and crime commissioners in England and Wales. Northumbria has had to make £123.4 million of cuts and efficiencies to manage the reductions imposed by government over that period." They go on to say, "Northumbria experienced the largest impact of the cuts because it receives more in grants in proportion to its council tax, around 86% in grants in 2016 to 17. They provide what they call a summary of the proposed council tax and revenue and capital budget for 2017 to 18, which says, quote, "A proposed revenue budget of £262.543 million for policing and crime reductions that includes provisions for increases in pay and prices of £6.8 million and budget pressures of £2.3 million. A reduction in revenue costs of £1.2 million to support capital investment, budget savings of £12.2 million in 2017 to 18, capital investment in buildings, vehicles and new technologies of £13.2 million, the use of £1.5 million from the Commissioner's reserves to support the revenue budget and provide headroom to manage savings going forward. Agree to an increase of £5 per year on the council tax precept in 2017 to 18 to raise an additional £2.570 million income." So that's the budget breakdown that they provide. And it's possible to see from this alone that the budget that the police have to work with is stretched in many, many different ways. It's not simply a case of crime prevention being the sole financial focus of the police. And when you compare the overall budget figure of £262.543 million to the budget figure from 2016 to 17 of £266.840 million, the size of the decrease is obvious. This has been a continual trend since 2010, with the BBC reporting that Northumbria Police has had its budget cut by 23% over the last several years. It's worth taking the time here, I think, to say that police funding comes from two main sources: government grants and council tax precepts. As I mentioned previously, 86% of Northumbria Police's funding in 2016 to 17 was through central government grants. However, the budget report says that, quote, "Government grants have been cut by £3.0 million or 1.4%, and the Home Office has made an assumption that this cut will be offset by an increase to the precepts of £5 to generate an additional £1.9 million of council tax income." That was the agreed increase listed in the report summary. So these constraints on the policing budget in Northumbria Police's jurisdiction has led to on-the-ground effects such as police stations not being open at all times, which creates problems for the local community. Aside from the Waterloo Place station, which will continue to be open 24/7, all others will be closed by late evening, many as early as 5 p.m. Since the public view is that violent or antisocial crime happens at night, it's going to concern people that their local police stations will be closed before night, even if they do have other ways of reporting crimes. Northumbria Police have also made assurances that, quote, these changes do not affect the number of operational stations or the availability of our officers. However, further compromises to the force caused by financial concerns may well do precisely that, and this situation is definitely something that I think people should be contacting their MPs about and trying to fight against. So now let's move on to the final story. The organisation Action on Smoking and Health, also known as ASH, have produced a report that looks at the changing attitudes of the public over the last 10 years to the smoking ban in 2007. So, before I take a look at the report and go through some of the points in it, I'll talk about who ASH actually are. On their website, they say, quote, Action on Smoking and Health was established in 1971 by the Royal College of Physicians. It is a campaigning public health charity that works to eliminate the harm caused by tobacco. We do not attack smokers or condemn smoking. And finally, they say that they're governed by a board of trustees, which includes Professor John Moxham, who's a consultant in respiratory medicine at King's College Hospital. It also includes Marissa Crook, Head of Finance at Cancer Research UK, and Professor Martin Jarvis, who's a Professor of Health Psychology at University College. They say that their goals are, quote, to develop opinion and awareness about the tobacco epidemic and to press for policy measures that will reduce the burden of addiction, disease, and premature death attributed to tobacco. So now we know a little of what the organisation is, or at least who's some of the main people in it. Let's turn to the report, which is entitled Smoke Free, the First 10 Years, Tackling the Smoking Epidemic in England, the Views of the Public. The first thing they talk about is public support for smoke-free legislation before the ban. They say, quote, public support for smoke-free legislation just before its enactment was high. In April 2007, 78% of adults supported the law to make all enclosed workplaces, including public places, smoke-free. Non-smokers were especially likely to support the legislation, 88% did so. Which, of course, isn't a great surprise, but they also say that even among non-smokers, there was some enthusiasm for the new laws. 40% said they supported the change. They then go on to say, quote, support for smoke-free legislation has increased in all regions of England over the past decade, with at least 4 out of 5 adults in every region now supporting the legislation. The regions where support was lower in 2007 have tended to catch up with the others. The biggest increase has been in the northwest, up from 76% in 2007 to 85% in 2017. The East Midlands up from 71% to 83%, and the South West up from 77% to 84%. The next point is about keeping children safe from secondhand smoke. On this, they say that, quote, understanding of the harm to children of second-hand smoke is likely to have strengthened public support for new legislation banning smoking in cars carrying children that came into force in England and Wales on October the 1st, 2015. Attitudes to this ban were first tested in the ASH Smoke-Free England survey in 2008, when 77% of all respondents said that they supported banning smoking in cars that are carrying children younger than 18 years old. Only 48% of smokers said that they supported such a ban, compared to 86% of non-smokers. When the survey was conducted in early 2015, prior to the implementation of the ban, support had risen to 85% overall. So far the results are pretty much what you would expect. Situations like smoking in public places and in cars with children are generally considered not to be good things, and the results of these surveys reflect that. Now let's take a look at putting tobacco out of sight, at least not having it on display in places that it's sold. The report says, quote, "Public attitudes to putting tobacco out of sight were first explored in the Smoke-Free England Survey 2007. Even then, long before the policy had been debated publicly, 53% of respondents in England supported banning the display of cigarettes in places where they are sold. The question was repeated each year to 2011 with mixed results. Then it was changed to a different formulation, putting tobacco products out of sight in shops in 2012. This new question resulted in an increase in support to 57%. In 2007, 62% of non-smokers and 26% of smokers supported banning the display of cigarettes where they are sold. By 2017, 78% of non-smokers and 41% of smokers supported it. Although less than half of smokers actually support the ban, apparently only 28% actively opposed it. The remainder were neither in support nor particularly opposed to it. Interestingly, something that Ash doesn't actually mention in this report is the potential effects that seeing cigarettes on display can have on young people. In fact, looking at the British Medical Journal, they actually look at this point as part of a paper called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Removal of Point-of-Sale Tobacco Displays in Norway. Now, I haven't looked at the complete thing, but the abstract of the results reads, quote, "Pre-implementation, young people were tempted by tobacco products when seeing them in the shop more often than older people. Post-implementation, young people also found it more difficult to choose a brand. The removal of point-of-sale tobacco displays was perceived as a barrier for young people's access to tobacco products, as affecting attachment to cigarette brands and as contributing to tobacco denormalization." So arguably, this idea of putting tobacco out of sight where it's being sold might have actually been a better way to tackle smoking from the start, rather than beginning by banning it in public places. There is no question, of course, that helped, but if the enticement isn't there, you can end up with an entire generation growing up having never seen cigarettes on sale, which, as the BMJ report says, makes consumption appear abnormal. The Ash report goes on to talk about banning smoking in all cars, about which they say, quote, "Public support for a ban on smoking in all cars has grown since the policy was first presented in the Smoke-Free England Survey 2009. Then overall support stood at 45%. 10 years later, this has increased to 62%. So the overall trend of this entire report from Ash is that overall more people seem to support more stringent methods of tackling smoking than they did 10 years ago. But I think more interestingly, it also suggests that the attitude of people is generally less favourable to the idea of smoking, and not just from a personal health standpoint either. It's rather unfortunate to me that all of this had to come about through government legislation banning things, but in this case you can certainly see the benefits, and you can definitely say that it did more good than harm. And that's all for this episode of The Moment. Join me in a fortnight's time for more from around Northumberland and Newcastle. Until then, I'm Oliver Ralph, and this is The Moment.